Good day, lovely people, and welcome to another episode of The Daily Dose with me, Dr. Essa. In the studio today, well, obviously because of social distancing, she's not actually here with me, but we've got a very interesting guest. It's Fasiha Hassan. How are you, Fasiha?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Great. So, Fasiha, would you like to introduce yourself to my audience? Just give them a quick introduction to who you are and what you do currently and what you've done before.
So my name is Fasiha. I'm currently the youngest MPL or public representative at the Gauteng provincial legislature. But you may also know us from Seasons for Activism, etc.
Okay, that is cool. Thank you. So let's get straight into it. Let's just get straight into it. Today's episode, we're going to be discussing the politics and the policies behind our national lockdown after the COVID-19 pandemic hit South Africa. So the first question, and this is something I get asked a lot by a lot of the audience members since we've started this podcast, is why did the South African government implement the lockdown specifically now? Why now? Why not earlier? Why not maybe later? Can you maybe give us some insight into that?
There's a few things. The first is I think South Africa was looking at countries who failed to act fast enough, hence why we acted within 3 weeks, which I think is actually quite a fast, in theory, response rate. But it's not just that. A lockdown is a very extraordinary measure. You're really curbing many civil rights of people, freedom of movement, etc. So it's not an easy decision to make, number one. But number two, the reason why the president, and I think people remember, he was meant to speak on Sunday, then Monday, etc., was because there was need for consultation. You can't just lock down and say, right, that's it. We saw this in India, where the prime minister did that, and hundreds of thousands of people were just stranded and were unable to do anything. So we had to consult with food manufacturers, the transport industry, etc., just to make sure that we manage the lockdown and handle the lockdown in a way that's most beneficial, not just to contain the virus, but to ensure that South African citizens will get what they need. So it was a balance between then and now, but I still think we implemented the lockdown at the right time. It was difficult to implement it earlier for the reasons that I said, but at least it wasn't too late.
And so, do you think that perhaps because I spoke about this in one of my earlier episodes, in that there's actually an optimal point in any country with any viral outbreak. There's an optimal point where if you lock down at that point, it's most effective. And if you lock down too early, the country may suffer from the financial losses far more than they would from the virus. And if you lock down too late, then our healthcare sector suffers quite drastically. Do you have any insight on that? Or do you think that we did it at the right time? Or was that a consideration of the government?
That was a big consideration. Especially given the pressures on our economy. I think a lockdown for us, if you put the virus aside, is the worst possible thing for the economy. But of course, the priority of the government, of all of us, should be saving human life.
Of course.
So that was the balance that had to be put across. So in my personal opinion, I think we locked down at the right time, and we're starting to slowly see, and I mean, it's not conclusive yet, but we're starting to see progress in terms of the containment. Of course, this will change when we start implementing, which we have, the mass-based testing. And all factors are pointing to the fact that we locked down at the right time.
Okay. All right. And then just going forward, how is the government assisting at a socioeconomic level? Because I know a lot of people, small, medium businesses, they're really suffering at this time. That's one sector. And then the other sector is obviously we have a huge gap of wealth inequality in this country. And there's a lot of people that are going to suffer during this lockdown. So what measures has the government put in place to help at both these levels?
Right, so there's different measures on different levels, national, provincial, local. But I
Mm-hmm.
think the first thing that's very important to note is what we call the social compact. So it's governments working with civil society, the private sector unions. It's kind of bringing everybody together. So in terms of actual support, there's the Solidarity Fund, which anybody can donate to. And I think Mary Oppenheimer and that group donated a lot of money towards that. And that support is for a lot of things. It's for like PPEs, protective gear. It also, to some extent, and I'll talk about this on a provincial level, food hampers, etc. But there's also a separate fund that has been established to support small businesses, in which actually government has put through quite a lot of seed funding just to make it start up and make sure there's something there. But on a provincial level is where we're seeing the bigger intervention in terms of food hampers, sanitizers, sanitary packs, not just to homeless shelters, but to even informal settlements. A lot of people we know who are casual workers are not earning an income during this time. So we've also bolstered the UIF, but in addition to that, we're also trying to give out and identify families who need that assistance, not just in terms of food and sanitary stuff, but even counseling, even social work elements and stuff. And that's a lot of what we've also been doing as public reps, going out, interacting and trying to understand who needs what kind of support. But yeah, also on a national level, there's the water tanks, there's the different sanitizers, soaps that are being given out. So it's multi-leveled. It's covering business, small businesses, but it's also covering society itself. And we're trying to bring and marry everything together so that no one gets left behind. Of course, it's not a perfect science. There are cracks. And I think every day, that's why we see some of the restrictions changing or the regulations changing. We see that sometimes there are different calls that are put out. Sometimes you'll see different reactions. So we're also learning from a situation in which no one has any precedent. There's no here's a hand guide to how to deal with COVID-19. We're learning as we go along.
I see. Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of other countries are also battling. A lot of presidents have no idea how long this is going to last, what the implications are going to be on the economy, exactly because in the history of our modern civilization, we haven't had such a global lockdown. But I think another question that I've been thinking quite extensively about, and some people also share my same sentiments. Over this period of time, since our lockdown and just prior to the lockdown, we've seen a lot of extraordinary measures that the government has taken to assist the poor, those without clean water, sanitation. I recently read an article about Lindiwe Sisulu. She's the Minister of Human Settlements. And she actually found 29 areas that are heavily populated, 29 heavily populated areas in South Africa. I'm assuming the majority of them are just townships. And she then has identified 29 pieces of land where potentially these people could be moved to in order to assist with social distancing. So my question is, do you find it a bit strange or bizarre? Or do you find it that it might be a slap in the face to the poor in our country that after 26 years under ANC leadership, it takes a virus or a pandemic for the government to actually realize that poor people need sanitation, running water, and land or space? What are your thoughts on this?
I think the first thing that we have to be honest about and acknowledge are the challenges and the backlog in terms of service delivery, right? That's something as a number one starting point. But we also have to understand the measures that have been put in place now. And we're in a crisis, we're in a disaster, and we see crisis level interventions being put in place. And a lot of these interventions, I'll speak to what you said about Minister Sisulu in a moment, but a lot of these interventions that are being put in place are temporary in nature. They're not permanent. And let's talk a bit about the water tanks, right? So a water tank, giving it to a a family that doesn't have access to water now will help us during the lockdown, right? But you can't live in a water tank your whole life.
Of
That's
course,
the
of course,
solution. The better solution and the more structural solution is to create piped water to that area so everybody has access to running water.
I agree.
So we need to also look at the nature of the interventions that are put in place. They are temporary. So that's the first thing. But the second, and I think this is actually the priority of everything, is to save human life.
Of course.
And to prioritize that above the economy, above all these different things, because at the end of the day, there's nothing that equates to the loss of human life, especially on a mass scale. So what's being provided is to make us get through this particular crisis. But it's not just that, right? We're in a situation where it's now a state of disaster and there's a lockdown. So schools are closed. Higher education is closed. And what that means is the money that would have gone towards those elements that are now not operational or functional, we can take that money and put it towards where it's needed the most: healthcare, water, transport. In the normal state of things, you can't just do that, right? We have to stretch the fiscus. It has to go through parliament. That's why a state of disaster was declared, so that we can take money from where it's less needed to where it needs to be right now, which is not a normal situation. And that's in many ways why you'll see a lot of these interventions happening very quickly. Number one, because the procedures are designed to be faster. But number two, because that money, like I said, we don't have to maintain this particular university of Malanga, for example, just for an example. That money can then go towards where it needs to go in the very first place. But I acknowledge what people are saying, and I think we need to be very clear that we want structural solutions. That, in fact, if we look at housing, because this is what Minister Sisulu was talking about, South Africa, as much as there's a backlog, has one of the largest housing projects in the Southern Hemisphere in history. And when we talk housing, it's not just a house. It includes services, electricity, water, sanitation, and that ultimately is the goal. So we're trying to make some of those interventions more long-term, but it is difficult for the reasons that I've explained, because once we're back up and running, that money will have to go to an SOE or factory or whatever the case may be. That money now needs to go back to where it originally was. So it's a careful balance, but I acknowledge that there's a sense of how did this happen so quickly? Why are we not doing this more often? And I think as politicians, as public representatives, we have a lot to learn from it as well, especially around bureaucracies and red tape that maybe we need to look at removing.
Because, I mean, look, one could argue that for a very long time, South Africa has always been in a state of disaster. If you look at our healthcare currently and the issues that we're facing, a lot of them are related to the things that I mentioned: sanitation, running water, space. Because, I mean, obviously infectious diseases spread faster, as we know, when people live in close proximity with each other. But also clean water and sanitation is also very important. I mean, currently in our country, more children die from, diarrhea, from diarrhea and poor sanitation than almost anything else in our country. In fact, I remember very clearly that when we were taught about HIV in this country, we were taught that we should rather instruct mothers who are HIV positive to continue breastfeeding their child and take their treatment as opposed to telling them to go and buy formula, because people can't even afford that. Then children suffer from malnutrition and die of diarrhea because mothers can't properly sanitize the bottles, and then children develop those types of infections and then die anyway. So we'd rather the mother taking the treatment and the child then also taking treatment, and at least the mother can feed her child and the child won't die of malnutrition at the risk of the child developing HIV, which is currently now treatable, So if we look at the fact that, in our healthcare sector, which I can only speak of, we already, in my opinion, for a very long time have been in a sort of state of disaster where basic things like sanitation, running water are affecting people's health. my question is then, why only now? Why only now? Or why could these measures not have been put in place maybe even a few years ago when we identified that these were issues? Do you have an opinion on that?
Look, I have to agree with you that healthcare requires a lot of attention. That's something we can't run away from, and it's also something that the NHI is trying to equalize the playing field in terms of healthcare. Now, one of the problems I think that we're facing is because of the unprecedented nature of the crisis. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. The interventions that we're putting in place are temporary and are not the best structural solutions. So in many ways, you're not seeing this kind of indiscrepancy entirely. It seems like it to the untrained person who doesn't know the kinds of interventions that were put in place. And I think it's also because of how infectious the disease is that it's taken us all by surprise. And also, building on what you were saying about HIV and nutrition, South Africa, given all these factors, is going to be incredibly hard hit, more so than Italy, more so than Spain, more so than the US. If you think what you're seeing there is harrowing, you better prepare yourself, because if we don't curb this thing, given the fact that we have a very vulnerable sort of population group, we're going to see much, much worse kind of numbers. And I think that's why the priority has been to try and save human lives. But I agree with you, Suhail. I think that this particular virus has just shone a further light on how unequal society is, on the different sort of levels of service that people get. And I think we're also just trying to adapt in a time in which we're in a complete crisis mode. The priority is for us to deal with the crisis. It's not a normal situation. And we really are just trying to do our best in terms of saving lives. Is it perfect? No, I don't think we're ever going to get this perfectly done. Does this mean we're not going to have issues in the healthcare system next week, 2 months from now? No, we are going to have those issues. But what we can learn from this is that there are a number of interventions that we can try and use. Like I mentioned, the bureaucracies and how long it takes to build a hospital. Those are things we can look at removing so that we can enhance what we're meant to do. So I think that this virus has done a lot in terms of enhancing the paradox, but also just showing us how severely unequal society is and how much more we have to do to try and equal the playing field. But I concede, I think that healthcare needs a lot of help even before this.
No, I think that's very insightful. I just have a few more questions. So tell me,
I'm here.
Okay, tell me, can you just clarify for us some of the main points in terms of what are the restriction policies currently, and why do we have those specific ones? If there's anything abnormal, I mean, if you look at comparing it to other countries and what they have done, why our certain restriction policies? I mean, there are some obviously that a few people can't understand. Like, I mean, I've speculated on the banning of alcohol and cigarettes, for example, but obviously I don't have any full or true insight into why it was banned. So maybe you could just speak on a few of the restrictions and how it differs from other countries.
Okay, so the restrictions or the regulations that we have in place, they change. I think this is important, and this has caused a lot of frustration for people. But it's also because we're learning from what one restriction can do to another one. So sometimes some of those change. But as of now, to what I know, there's restrictions we know on transport. And this was a big debate with the Minister of Transport, Fikile Mbalula, who I think eventually they came up with an agreement of 70% capacity in taxis. But from tomorrow, from Monday, it's going to be operating during those morning and evening times again. It's not going to be the whole day. The only reason why it was the whole day was for social grant payment, for people to actually get their grants.
Okay.
So that's on transport. Obviously, healthcare workers, essential workers, you're allowed to be out. You're allowed to be buying groceries, medicine. If you need healthcare, that's fine.
Which is similar to the other countries, right? Those are all similar.
But where it becomes different, number one, there's a few. Let me actually start here. Because we have a country that's more at risk than, let's say, a European population because of our high HIV statistics, because of TB, because of malnutrition. We need more strict regulations. That's the first thing. But it also means that things like a ban on alcohol, as much as it may seem controversial, is all because we are trying to alleviate any pressure on the healthcare system. So you can, I don't know if this is something you've experienced, but
yes, no, I definitely, that was my reasoning. That's exactly what I said in my previous podcast, is that I think the only reason why alcohol is banned is just to take that burden off the healthcare sector, because our casualty departments are now fairly empty since the banning of sale of alcohol. So
exactly. So what we want to do, or rather we don't want our healthcare workers focusing on unnecessary or avoidable situations like fights, stabbings, etc. that could occur. Doesn't mean it does, but could occur from abuse of alcohol. And we're already seeing that. Many healthcare workers are saying, great, it means we can focus our attention on COVID-19. So it's not to abuse anybody. It's not because we don't want you to have a good time in your life. It's because we're in a state of crisis. We really need to protect the healthcare system. The other thing about cigarettes, now, I'll tell you what the position is, and I'll tell you what my personal thoughts are. Anything that harms the respiratory system, in theory, should be removed, right? Because the virus attacks your respiratory system, and we're trying to ensure that, given that we're all more vulnerable, that we're not weakening the health of our people and the system to deal with it, right? So it also helps to give a blanket restriction, and I'll explain this now. Someone who's been smoking for 20 years and stops for 21 days, it may not make a big difference. But for other people, it would. Now, we can't go and ban people who've been smoking only for 20 years. It becomes difficult. So a blanket ban helps for regulation and helps us to deal with the situation. So we're not saying smoking leads to COVID-19. We're saying if you are a smoker, if you have emphysema, if you have asthma, you are more at risk of suffering from COVID-19, or you will be harder hit by it. But in my personal opinion, it's a difficult regulation because some people may not be more averse to it, and it may not make a huge difference, but we're just trying to check all of our boxes to ensure that we protect society. And this may be a restriction that is looked at later. I don't know. I don't sit in the command council, but I know it's a discussion that's ongoing. So if they find, and of course, after consulting with healthcare professionals, the WHO, etc., if they then feel that, okay, this ban is something we can remove, that's something they can discuss.
Has anyone else?
The idea was to protect the respiratory system of people.
Have any other countries implemented this restriction that you know of?
The smoking one I'm not fully aware of, but the alcohol one I've seen in a number of different African countries, Kenya as well. I think yesterday there was an athlete who was arrested for publicly drinking. So the alcohol one there is precedent for. The cigarette one, I'm not 100% sure of which other countries have implemented it.
Yeah, because I mean, it also came at a bit of a shock to me. But after having spoken to other just business owners and people that form part of essential services, the explanation that they got was also that we're trying to protect people's respiratory systems if it's going to be affected by the virus. Which I definitely think that it's a good initiative, and I mean, in most psychology books they'll tell you that it takes 21 days or 27 days to form or break a habit. So hopefully we'll see less smokers after these restrictions. But we were also just discussing how our restrictions differ from others, and I think an interesting example, and one that I think you might be able to share more light on, is China. Now, do you think us being a democracy and having a history of defying our government?
So there, the police and the army are far more brutal than here, or than probably in most places. And in truth, I think they used a lot more force to get that kind of adherence. And generally, if you ask the average Chinese person in a safe environment, they will tell you that they're afraid of their government.
Okay.
And we've seen this. I even if the people who reported it early on, and I think there will be investigations later about how initially they didn't take this thing too seriously, and only when it became a widespread crisis did they acknowledge it.
Well, look, some may say that they didn't take it too seriously, and others say that they knew how serious it was. So when people started raising red flags, they didn't want mass hysteria to spread across their country or the word to get out in the news. And I've heard of some instances where doctors were, told not to reveal any of the data, and they're not allowed to investigate these strange respiratory symptoms that are coming up.
Yeah. So that's true. I think we've seen that, and it will be interesting after this virus to see what is concluded on that. But getting back to this democracy versus kind of China. In South Africa, it's a very nuanced situation because people who are living in shacks, obviously it's much harder to obey the lockdown. They are not able to stockpile or panic buy. They get very little. They get what they need on a daily basis. There are a lot of people in one space. So this thing of people are leaving their houses, and we can give benefit of the doubt, out of necessity, not because they want to necessarily defy the government, because no one wants to die or get sick. I think that's a basic instinctual life survival kind of thing.
Yeah.
So we need to compare that firstly. But we also have to understand, and I think you mentioned this earlier, a little bit about the culture of South Africa. We have this culture of often, and we see this even when people go through roadblocks, we see it when people are driving. There doesn't seem to be this huge emphasis on the rule of law. And we've all done it, right? People driving the emergency lane when you're late, crossing the road. Why should we cross in a zebra crossing when we can just cross here, you see? Things like that, which don't help. And that's also why I think we've had to see the police and the army being brought in to implement. And we can speak about brutality as a separate issue, which I think we should. But the reason why they've also been brought in is because of what I said earlier, this potential large-scale death that could happen. So we need to obey it even more so than a country like Canada or a country like the UK, because we stand more to lose. And that's also why our restrictions are more stringent.
Yeah, and look, I fully agree with that. As an ideology, I agree that all South Africans should. But what I want to know is, how practical do you think it is? Do you think that South Africans, because in my opinion, I don't think South Africans, or not everyone, but I would say there are in many communities, especially in the lower socioeconomic class, who may not fully understand the virus or how it spreads, may not want to adhere because they don't fully understand. That's one. And also practically, how can they observe social distancing? How can they continuously wash their hands if they've got no water? How practical? That's in essence what I'm trying to get your opinion on. How practical do you think this lockdown is for a lot of South Africans?
You've identified the big problem. That in theory, in an ideal world, everybody would obey because it's possible, because they had access to whatever they need access to. And that's the difficulty with the nature of a lockdown. That I agree with you, it's very difficult for people in informal settlements and in those areas to abide by. So practicality does play a part. But because we're in the state of crisis, we have to adopt what we will now think as abnormal measures in order for us to curb and contain it. So this is not a normal situation. We should never, ever find ourselves in a situation where movement of people is so severely restricted, or, your freedom of expression is so severely restricted. But I think it comes down to the same thing every time, that the number one priority is to save lives, to prevent the mass infection in townships, and ultimately to come out the other side, having said we have minimal loss of life and minimal strain on the system. But I agree with you, it is difficult. And one of the things that, I don't know if people have been listening in, but if somebody gets COVID-19 who lives in a highly or densely populated area, if they need to self-isolate, we're going to have to remove them from that space and put them in a different site, a quarantine site, or, a space where
Are there
other people are
contingency plans for
self-isolating.
quarantine sites currently? Because I've heard of a few
Yes.
in KZN. I haven't really heard much about Gauteng. Are there sites?
Yeah.
Do you have any info on those?
There are sites that have been identified that are going to be sort of transferred or put towards like a quarantine site. That list we can get, it's definitely being identified. And in fact, the way I understand it is we're also trying to procure stuff like hospital beds, ventilators, all the necessary things that we would need for those spaces. Because we don't want somebody who tests positive to remain in that community where it's very difficult to self-isolate and you live with 8 people. Obviously, with 8 people are going to get it, and we know how quickly this thing spreads. It will be everywhere very fast. So there are those interventions and measures that are being put in place. I think we also saw it when the people from Wuhan came back. There's that space in the Port of
Yeah. No, yeah.
There's different interventions like that are being put through, that are being planned, and that people are being trained for.
Okay. Well, I mean, at least we are, putting plans in place for that, because as I have mentioned before on my show, that I think things are going to get far worse in the upcoming weeks, regardless of how well we implement our lockdown. We do have a very big vulnerable population. But, my last question on a bit of a lighter note, and we discussed this a bit yesterday on the podcast. I thought maybe I'll just ask you, do you have any conspiracy theories? Do you believe in any? Do you entertain any? Is there anything that you specifically, think holds some weight in terms of the conspiracies that you've heard? I mean, we've heard about 5G towers being able to spread the virus. There's one theory that China invented this virus so that it's some biochemical warfare against the rest of the world, so they can be the biggest superpower. Do you believe in any conspiracy? Oh, the US. Did the US create?
Apparently.
I thought it was the Chinese. Well, look, there's plenty. Do you entertain any of these?
No, I don't. And I'm glad you spoke about 5G, because I was recently added to a very silly WhatsApp group that was insinuating that.
Yeah.
And we had to report it because it's just not logical. I think this is very important. I know we're afraid. I know there's mass panic, but let's please be logical.
Yeah.
Please,
I mean,
because
yeah, those WhatsApp groups will really get you. I'm in too many WhatsApp groups where people are sharing the most ridiculous information, like these, those types of videos where it's like everything is linked to the Illuminati and we're gonna,
the world is flat kind of thing.
Yeah, I think we should just all.
Thing, though,
I think, you know what, at some point the government needs to ban WhatsApp groups, or at least aunties on WhatsApp groups, because they will share whatever they get. They don't check the source. It doesn't matter. We have to believe that the 5G towers are causing flu-like symptoms. I don't know.
Exactly. But I think one thing, you asked me which ones would I think.
Sorry?
In human...
Yeah.
Which sort of theories do you
which
might be the case?
Yeah.
So look, natural selection, in terms of how the nature of the universe works, every few cycles we see viruses like this curb human population. I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's created, but it's kind of about how nature balances things out, because we don't have enough food to feed the people, etc., etc.
Exactly.
So this is probably what it is. Especially given the fact that it spread so quickly. And I think it's also just showed us you can be as rich as you want, you can be as powerful as you think you may be, but you still will succumb to your health and to a virus like this. So in many ways, for me, it's also showing the crisis of capitalism. Capitalism is on its knees because of a small virus that can't be seen. So I think we just need to reflect a little bit about that and use this as an opportunity to hopefully change how we deal with issues, and hopefully our humanity will grow from this. Because if your humanity is not growing in a crisis like this, then I think the human race is even worse off than we were before.
Well, that's very well put. Thank you very much for joining me on my show, Fasiha. I really
Thank you,
appreciate
Sahil.
your opinions on this, and it's been great chatting about politics and the policies. Hopefully, maybe towards the end of the lockdown, I'll have you back on the show so we can discuss how effective the lockdown's been and what future plans we have. But thank you once again for all of my, I don't know how many audience members I have, but however many you guys are. Thank you again for joining us. That's another daily dose episode with me, Dr. Essa, and my guest, Fasiha Hassan. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Peace, love, assalamu alaikum. Stay safe and wash your hands. Don't forget.